My name is Ray Holt, and I want to be clear about something before this story begins. I am not a fighter. I am not a soldier. I am a communications engineer who has spent 11 years fixing broken relay systems on outer belt stations for people who never remember my name, but always remember to call me when something stops working. I am the kind of person that powerful species look at and immediately stop worrying about. That was their mistake. It started on Relay Station Drevos 9, where I had been working a repair contract for 6 weeks. The station was small and remote and staffed by a skeleton crew of 12, sitting at the edge of the Dravosi belt, where the communication signals from the inner systems got thin and needed boosting to reach the outer colonies. The Krethal arrived on a Wednesday morning without warning or announcement, because that is how the Krethal operate. They do not declare. They arrive. Their ship was 3 times the size of the station, and their boarding party was 12 soldiers in black armor who moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before and found it easy every time. They took the station in 11 minutes. The crew was separated and processed, which meant scanned, cataloged, and assigned. The Krethal ran a system of labor conscription across the outer belt, taking skilled workers from small stations and putting them to use on Krethal infrastructure projects in places where their own workers did not want to go. I was cataloged as a communications engineer, which meant I was considered useful, which meant I was taken aboard the ship instead of simply removed from the station and left to arrange my own transport home. At the time, I thought that was the worst outcome. I was wrong. The Krethal ship was called the Dorvan, and it was the most sophisticated piece of engineering I had ever been inside. The communications architecture alone was extraordinary, layered and redundant, and built for a range that dwarfed anything the outer belt stations were running. I was taken to the communications level by a guard who said nothing and pointed at a workstation and walked away, and I sat down and looked at the system I had been assigned to maintain and spent the first hour just understanding what I was looking at. It was remarkable. It was also, I noticed, built on a fundamental architecture that I had worked with before, adapted and expanded far beyond its original design, but still recognizable at its core to someone who had spent 11 years with his hands inside communication relay systems across the outer belt. I did not say this out loud. I started working. I maintained what they told me to maintain, fixed what they told me to fix, and said very little because saying very little was the fastest way to stop being watched closely, and I needed to stop being watched closely. The guard assigned to the communications level was a Krethal officer named Voss. He was tall and broad, with the gray-scaled skin and flat yellow eyes of the northern Krethal bloodlines, and he watched me for the first 3 days with the focused attention of someone who had been told humans were unpredictable and was taking that briefing seriously. On the 4th day, he stopped watching as closely, because I had done nothing for 3 days except exactly what I was told. On the 5th day, he started checking on me only twice per shift instead of 4 times. On the 6th day, he brought something to read and sat in the corner and paid attention to it more than to me. I used the time he was reading to learn the system, not my assigned section, the whole system. I worked from the core architecture outward, the way I always did with unfamiliar systems, because understanding a thing completely is the only way to understand what it is actually capable of. I moved slowly and carefully and never touched anything I was not supposed to touch. I just read and mapped and understood. By the end of the 2nd week, I knew the Dorvan's communication system better than anyone on the ship except possibly the engineer who had designed it, and that engineer was not aboard. I also knew 3 things that the Krethal did not know I knew. First, the long-range communication array had a harmonic vulnerability in its secondary frequency band that meant any sufficiently targeted pulse on that frequency would knock out long-range communications completely for between 40 minutes and 2 hours depending on the prize. Amplitude. Second, the navigation communication relay that linked the bridge to the engine room ran through the communications level on a hard line that passed within arm's reach of my workstation. Third, and most importantly, the emergency beacon system for the entire ship was routed through a single junction in the communications level that had been built for access during exactly the kind of maintenance work I had been assigned. I sat with this information for 4 days. I did not rush. Rushing was how people made mistakes, and mistakes in my position had a very limited range of outcomes. I thought carefully about sequence and timing and what I needed and what I did and what I did not have and how to get from the first thing to the last thing in the right order. Then I waited for the right moment. The right moment came on a Thursday morning when Voss was absorbed in whatever he was reading, and the shift rotation had just changed, and the communications level was at its quietest. I reached into the junction beside my workstation, the one that was there for maintenance AC. And I made 3 small adjustments that took 40 seconds and required nothing more than the multi-tool I had been using openly for 2 weeks without anyone finding it interesting. The long-range communications went down first. The bridge-to-engine room relay went dark 11 seconds later, which I knew because Voss looked up from his reading when the status light on the wall changed color. The emergency beacon activated 40 seconds after that, broadcasting on every standard frequency used by outer belt patrol vessels with the Dorvan's position, registry, and to destroy this, and the curse ends, and a destroys code that I had found in the emergency manual that was filed under maintenance documentation and which I had read thoroughly on my 4th day aboard. Voss was on his comm immediately, and the communications level went from quiet to very loud, very quickly, and I sat at my workstation and did not move and kept my expression neutral and waited. The Crethal spent 20 minutes trying to understand what had happened. They were thorough and systematic and very good at what they did, which meant it took them 20 minutes instead of 10 to trace the fault back to the junction beside my workstation. When Voss figured out what had happened, he looked at me with those flat yellow eyes and the expression of someone who had been told humans were unpredictable and had not taken that briefing seriously enough. "You did this," he said. "I maintained what needed maintaining." I said. "You destroyed our communications." He said. "I created a maintenance event." I said. "It is in the log." He crossed the room in 4 steps and stood over me with the full height of the Northern Crethal bloodlines and the particular look of someone who is deciding between several options. "Your species," he said, very quietly. "We were told you never fight back. We were told you never make mistakes," I said. "It seems we both misinformed." The patrol vessel that responded to the beacon arrived 43 minutes later, which was inside the window I had calculated, and outside the window the Crethal had to restore long-range communications and call for support. The boarding was not as clean as the Crethal boarding of Drevos 9 had been, because this time the element of surprise was on the other side, and the Dorvan's crew spent the first 10 minutes trying to manage a communications blackout, a navigation relay failure, and an unexpected patrol vessel simultaneously, which was 3 things too many. When the outer belt patrol officers came through the communications level, they found me, sitting at my workstation with my hands visible and my multi-tool on the desk in front of me, and Voss standing 43, with an expression that had not changed in 43 minutes. The senior patrol officer looked at me, then at Voss, then at the maintenance log on my screen. "You did this," he said to me. "I created a maintenance event," I said again. He looked at the log for a moment. "With a multi-tool," he said. "It is a good multi-tool," I said. He looked at Voss one more time, and then back at me and made a sound that in any species would have translated as the involuntary response to something you find funny but are professionally obligated not to show. The debrief took 3 hours at the patrol station, and I told them everything I had mapped in 2 weeks aboard the Dorvan, which turned out to be considerably more useful to outer belt patrol operations than a communications engineer's maintenance log had any right to be. The senior officer who conducted the debrief was a Kelvari named Soren, precise and thorough, who asked the same questions 3 times from different angles the way good investigators do, and listened to the answers with the full weight of her attention. At the end, she closed her notes and looked at me across the table. "You spent 2 weeks doing exactly what they told you," she said. "To stop being watched." "Yes," I said. "And then you mapped their entire communications architecture." "I was curious," I said. "And then you mapped their entire communications architecture." "I was curious," I said. "And then you mapped their entire communications architecture." "I was curious," I said. "And then you mapped their entire communications architecture." "I was curious," I said. "It is an extraordinary system. And then you waited 4 more days before acting." "Rushing is how people make mistakes," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "The Crethal assessment of humans," she said slowly, "classifies your species as low threat, high compliance, and unlikely to initiate independent action under confinement." "I have heard," I said. "I am going to recommend a revision," she said. "It is probably overdue," I said. She almost smiled. It was brief and controlled, and she clearly had no intention of acknowledging it. She stood and gathered her notes and stopped at the door. "Ray Holt," she said. "Yes," I said. "The multi-tool," she said. "You had it for 2 weeks, and they never considered it a concern." "It is a maintenance tool," I said. "I am a maintenance engineer." "Yes," she said quietly. "You are." She left, and I sat alone in the debrief room and thought about 11 years of fixing broken relay systems for people who never remembered my name, and about 2 weeks aboard the most sophisticated communications system I had ever worked with, and about the 4 seconds it had taken to make 3 small adjustments to a junction that was built for exactly that purpose. I picked up my multi-tool and turned it over in my hands. It was a good multi-tool. I had always thought so.